The first time I realized my neighbors thought they owned my dock. I woke up on a Saturday morning, poured myself half a cup of burnt coffee, looked out across the lake, and saw a guy I had never met standing barefoot on my cedar planks eating a breakfast burrito like he paid property taxes there. He even nodded at me through the fog like we were old friends. Then he yelled back toward the water, "Hey, Kyle, tie the jet ski off over here. There's room." That was the moment something in me shifted. Now, if you've never lived on a lake in northern Michigan, there's this unspoken thing people always say about lake community. Everybody helps everybody. Folks wave from pontoons, neighbors borrow ladders and return them with a six-pack, that kind of thing. And honestly, that's how it used to be on Mercer Lake. Quiet little place, mostly older cabins and retirees, tucked behind a winding gravel road about 20 minutes outside Traverse City. My place sat near the far end of the shoreline where the trees got thicker and the water turned dark blue around dusk. I bought it after my divorce, back when I needed somewhere silence still sounded comforting instead of lonely. The dock was the reason I bought the property. Hand-built cedar, 40 feet out into the water, old iron supports driven deep into the lake bed sometime in the late 70s. The previous owner, an old carpenter named Walt Brennan, built the whole thing himself with his two sons. Guy was dying of cancer when I met him. He walked me down there during the inspection, tapped the railing with his knuckles, and said, "That dock'll outlive both of us if idiots stay off it." At the time, I laughed. Turns out Walt knew exactly what he was talking about. About 3 houses down lived Derek Holloway and his wife Shannon. Derek was one of those men who somehow managed to look aggressively expensive all the time, even while grilling hamburgers. Boat shoes, mirrored sunglasses, polo shirts with tiny embroidered flags on them. Worked in commercial real estate out of Grand Rapids. Or at least that's what everybody said. Honestly, I barely spoke to him the first year I lived there. We'd wave occasionally. That was it. Then one summer things changed. Derek bought a white speedboat, one of those loud fiberglass monsters that looked less like a lake boat and more like something a guy rents during a midlife crisis in Miami. After that, every weekend turned into a floating tailgate party. Friends came up from the city, coolers piled high, Bluetooth speakers blasting country remixes nobody asked for. Sometimes they'd anchor near the cove and drink until midnight. Annoying, sure, but still technically their business. Then they started tying off at my dock. At first, it happened once or twice. I figured maybe wind drifted them over. Maybe they needed to stabilize while unloading people. I told myself not to be that guy. Lake people hate that guy. Nobody wants the shoreline grump screaming about property lines. So I let it go. Then 4th of July weekend hit. I came back from the hardware store one afternoon and found 3 boats tied to my dock like it was a damn marina. Beer cans sitting on the bench Walt built 30 years ago. Wet footprints across the planks. One teenage kid had a fishing rod propped against my railing while he scrolled TikTok, completely unaware I owned the thing he was leaning on. I remember standing there holding a bag of mulch thinking, am I losing my mind here? A woman in a red swimsuit looked over at me and smiled. We'll only be here a little while. Not sorry. Not is this okay? Just assumption. Like my property had quietly become public convenience space because nobody stopped them the first time. I walked back up to the house angry in that slow-burning kind of way that sneaks up on you later. Not explosive anger. Worse. The kind where you replay conversations in the shower. The kind where your jaw hurts because you've been clenching your teeth for hours without realizing it. And the thing is, it wasn't really about the dock anymore. After my divorce, that lake house became the first thing in years that actually felt like mine. Not shared. Not negotiated through lawyers. Mine. I rebuilt the porch screens myself. Refinished the kitchen cabinets. Sat on that dock through 2 brutal winters wondering whether I even wanted to stay in Michigan anymore. So watching strangers treat it like public property, yeah, maybe it hit deeper than it should have. A week later, I finally confronted Derek. He was hosing down his boat in the driveway when I walked over. I said, "Hey, man, I need you and your friends to stop tying up at my dock." Simple, calm, respectful. He barely looked at me. "Relax," he said, still spraying the trailer tires. "It's a lake." I remember laughing once because the arrogance caught me off guard. "I know it's a lake," I said. "That's why there's a dock." That finally got his attention. He turned off the hose, looked at me over his sunglasses, and smiled this tight little smile like he was talking to somebody unreasonable. "We're not hurting anything. That sentence right there. That's the one people use when they've already decided your boundaries don't matter. And standing there in his driveway, with water dripping off that stupid white boat, I realized this was never going to stop on its own. After that conversation, things actually got worse, which honestly impressed me a little. Most people, once you call them out directly, they back off at least enough to save face. Derek? He doubled down like the whole thing had become personal. The very next Friday, I got home around 6:30 carrying groceries and saw his speedboat tied to my dock again. Except this time, there was even more of them. 2 boats, maybe 10 people total, music bouncing across the water hard enough to rattle my porch screen. Somebody had dragged a cooler halfway up my dock like they were setting up camp. And Derek saw me. That's the important part. He saw me standing there at the top of the hill holding grocery bags, and instead of untying the boat, or even pretending to apologize, he lifted a beer toward me like we were buddies at a barbecue. That little gesture, man. I carried my groceries inside, so carefully you'd think I was transporting explosives. My friend Nate used to say there are 2 kinds of anger. Hot anger burns fast and stupid. Cold anger builds systems. That night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the windows open to the lake, I decided I was done trying to win morally. I was going to win legally. See, Mercer Lake had all kinds of weird county regulations because of shoreline disputes back in the 90s. Most people ignored them because honestly nobody reads municipal code unless they're either retired or furious. At around midnight, I became both. I started digging through county property maps online, easement records, repair and access classifications, harbor ordinances. Half the language sounded like it had been written by pirates and insurance lawyers working together, but eventually I found something interesting. Private mooring registration. Turns out, if a dock met certain specifications and sat on deeded shoreline access, you could register it with the county as a restricted mooring structure, which meant unauthorized vessels tied to it could legally be cited, removed, and impounded by the harbor master's office. I actually sat back in my chair and whispered, "No way," at 2 in the morning, to an empty kitchen. Now here's the part people online always misunderstand when they hear this story. They think I immediately called the cops out of spite. I didn't. I gave Derek every chance imaginable to stop acting like my property belonged to the neighborhood. The next morning, I walked down to the dock carrying coffee and found Shannon sitting there alone while everybody else was still asleep up at their rental cabin. She always seemed quieter than Derek. Nervous, almost. I said, "Hey, Shannon, I'm serious about the dock thing." She sighed immediately like she'd been expecting it. "I know," she said softly. "Derek thinks you're overreacting." That irritated me more than if she'd argued. Would he feel that way if I parked my truck in his driveway every weekend? She gave this tiny laugh before catching herself. "I'll talk to him." And for about 5 whole days, I thought maybe that would actually work. Then came the poker night. 3 black pickup trucks lined their driveway. Floodlights on. Loud laughing echoing through the trees. Around midnight, I heard engines revving near shore, so I looked outside, and there they were again. Except this time somebody had tied not 1 but 3 boats across my entire dock like floating parking spaces. One of them was blocking my kayak lift. I stood there in the dark wearing sweatpants and 1 sock, just staring through the screen door while drunk strangers stepped across the cedar planks Walt Brennan built with his own hands. And something weird happened in that moment. I stopped feeling angry. I just felt done. The following Monday, I drove into town and started paperwork. The county marine office sat inside this old brick building beside the courthouse, and the woman behind the counter looked exactly like every Midwestern government employee you've ever met. Reading glasses hanging from a chain, coffee mug older than most marriages, absolutely impossible to intimidate. I explained the situation. She listened for maybe 30 seconds before saying, "Mercer Lake?" "Yeah." She nodded slowly. "White speedboat." I blinked. "You know them?" "Oh, honey," she said, already reaching for forms. "Everybody knows them." That sentence right there made the whole thing feel very different. Because suddenly, this wasn't me being sensitive. Derek had been bulldozing people for years, and everybody around the lake had apparently just learned to tolerate it, because confrontation is basically illegal in the Midwest unless football's involved. The registration process took 8 days. 8 unbelievably satisfying days. I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, boat registration numbers. I installed waterproof private mooring signs on each piling, sent certified letters, filed shoreline access maps, paid the registration fee. I even had the dock surveyed again just to eliminate any possible loophole Derek could squirm through later. And the entire time, they kept using the dock. Honestly, I think the signs offended Derek more than the confrontation did. One Saturday morning, he actually walked up into my yard holding one of the laminated notices. "What is this?" he asked. I said, "A sign." "No kidding." "Well then I guess we're both caught up." He stared at me for a second, jaw flexing. "You're really doing all this over a dock?" That question sat with me a while because technically, it was over a dock, but also not at all. It was about entitlement, about people deciding your patience means permission, about how certain personalities move through life assuming boundaries only exist for everybody else. I looked at him and said, "No, Derek, I'm doing this because you kept hearing please and translating it into keep going." He shook his head and laughed under his breath. "You know nobody likes a guy who causes problems at the lake, right?" That almost got me. For a second I actually felt embarrassed, because that's how guys like Derek operate. They make you feel socially guilty for objecting to your own mistreatment. They weaponize the fear of looking difficult. Then I noticed something behind him. Mrs. Alvarez from across the cove was standing on her porch pretending to water plants while very obviously listening. And farther downshore, old man Peterson was watching from his canoe. Nobody said anything. But suddenly I realized, people weren't rooting against me. They were waiting to see if somebody would finally say no to him. 3 days later, my registration officially cleared. I got the email at 9:14 in the morning while drinking coffee on the porch. Authorized private mooring status, active. I read it twice. Then I just sat there listening to the lake water hit the shoreline. Quiet. Still. Like the whole place was holding its breath. Friday came. At around 7 in the evening, Derek's speedboat rolled back into the cove with 2 other boats behind it like a little parade of bad decisions. Music echoing across the water. People laughing. Somebody already drunk enough to yell, "Whoa." And without hesitation, they tied all 3 boats directly onto my dock. I remember looking down at my phone for a long moment. Then I opened the harbor master contact I'd saved a week earlier. The woman who answered recognized my name immediately. I gave her the registration number. She said, "You want to proceed with enforcement?" I looked out across the water at Derek standing on my dock holding a beer in one hand like he owned the shoreline itself. And I said, very calmly, "Yeah, I think I do." The funny thing is, after I made the call, nothing happened right away. That's what made it feel so surreal. The lake stayed calm. Music kept playing. Somebody lit a citronella torch near shore. Derek and his friends laughed like any other Friday night, while I sat alone on my screened porch listening to ice melt in a whiskey glass, wondering whether I'd just gone too far over something that, a few months earlier, I probably would have shrugged off. And I'll admit this because nobody ever tells the honest part in stories like these. I barely slept that night. Not because I felt guilty exactly, but because I knew there was no undo button anymore. Once government paperwork enters a neighborhood feud, things change permanently. People pick sides. Smiles get tighter. Conversations get shorter at the mailbox. Around 7:45 the next morning, I heard an engine out on the water. Not the loud recreational kind either. Lower. Slower. Deliberate. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee and saw a dark green county enforcement vessel cutting across the lake through the morning fog. 2 officers on board. One steering. One holding a clipboard. And man, the silence that spread across the cove when people realized where that boat was heading. You could feel it. Derek's speedboat was still tied to my dock along with another ski boat from one of his friends. Empty beer cans sat near the cleats. Somebody had left flip-flops on my bench overnight. The county boat eased alongside my dock, so gently it barely disturbed the water. One officer looked up at me. "You Mr. Callahan?" "Yep." "You the reporting party?" "I am." He nodded once, checked the registration numbers against his clipboard, then said the most beautiful sentence I've ever heard spoken before 8 in the morning. "These vessels are unauthorized and subject to impound under county marine ordinance. I'm telling you right now, if you ever want to watch rich people wake up fast, have the government start untying their toys at sunrise." Within maybe 90 seconds, cabin doors started slamming up the shoreline. Derek came running down toward the dock wearing gym shorts and one untied sneaker, yelling before he even got close. "What the hell is this?" The older officer didn't even look at him. "Sir, step back from the dock. That's my boat." The officer calmly pointed toward the laminated sign bolted to the piling. This is registered private mooring property. You were previously notified. Derek looked at me then, really looked at me, and I watched the exact second realization hit him. I wasn't bluffing anymore. You called the county? He said. I shrugged slightly. You kept parking on private property. He actually laughed for a second, but it sounded panicked. You serious right now? Over docking space. The younger officer interrupted him. Sir, retrieval information will be available through county impound services. And then they started towing the boats away. Now here's the part burned into my memory forever. Derek standing ankle-deep in lake water, watching his white speedboat disappear across Mercer Lake behind a county tow vessel, while still trying to act like he wasn't embarrassed in front of half the shoreline. One of his friends walked down holding a phone and whispered, Dude, it says 400 plus storage. The color drained right out of Derek's face. I should probably tell you I didn't celebrate. Not outwardly anyway. No fist pumping. No smug speech. I just sat down in one of the old dock chairs Walt left behind years ago and listened to the lake again. Quiet. For the first time all summer, genuinely quiet. By sunset the whole community knew. Mrs. Alvarez brought over banana bread under the world's thinnest excuse imaginable. Oh, I just happened to bake extra. Sure. Old man Peterson paddled past my dock around dusk and tipped his fishing hat at me without saying a word. Even Nate called laughing so hard he could barely breathe. You got boats impounded? He yelled. Buddy, you just became lake folklore. But not everybody thought it was funny. Around 8 that evening, somebody pounded on my front door hard enough to shake the frame. Derek, sunburned, furious, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt with some yacht club logo stretched across the chest like a sponsorship nobody asked for. The second I opened the door he started in. You humiliated me. I leaned against the doorway. Pretty sure the county handled that part. His jaw tightened instantly. You could have talked to me like a man. I honestly almost laughed. Derek, I did. Multiple times. For a second, he just stood there breathing hard, trying to figure out whether anger or pride should drive the conversation. Then he said something I didn't expect. You know, everybody's talking about this now. And weirdly enough, that was the first honest thing he'd said the entire summer. Because he was right. The lake community split clean in half after that. Some people thought I'd done exactly what needed to happen. Others thought I'd escalated things too far and embarrassed a neighbor publicly over what should have stayed a private dispute. One woman at the marina actually told me there were kinder ways to handle it. Maybe. But kindness had already been tried for 3 straight months. 9 days later, Derek showed up again. Different energy this time. No yelling. No chest puffing. No audience. He stood on my porch holding a folded copy of the private mooring agreement I'd had drafted through the county template system. What's the monthly rate? He asked quietly. I told him. He winced. Then he signed it anyway. 30-day minimum. Paid in advance. My rules. And here's the part that still makes me laugh. After all that, after the arguments and the towing fees and the drama that spread across the entire lake, Derek became weirdly respectful. Every single time he used the dock after that, he texted first. Every time. Sometimes people don't understand boundaries until crossing them finally costs something. Now personally, I still don't know whether I handled everything perfectly. Maybe I did go nuclear over a dock. Maybe pride got involved somewhere along the way. But I also know this. If you let people treat your property, your time, or your peace like it belongs to them long enough, eventually they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as permission. And honestly, I think that's the real reason this whole thing exploded. So now I want to ask you, was I justified for having the boats impounded after months of warnings? Or should I have handled it differently before bringing in a county? Because even now, people around Mercer Lake still argue about it. And judging by the comments this story usually gets, I have a feeling you probably will too.